Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time, on the edge of a large forest, there lived a woodcutter with his wife and 2 children. The boy was called Hansel, and his sister was called Gretel. Now the woodcutter worked hard all day cutting logs, while his wife stacked them into neat piles, ready to sell to the villagers. Sometimes Hansel and Gretel would go with him into the forest, gathering nuts and berries. When their basket was full, they would play hide and seek amongst the tall trees until it was time for them all to go home. Every Friday, the woodcutter would carry a large bundle of logs to the village, hoping to sell them there. But at each house he stopped at, the villagers shook their heads sadly, for they had no money to pay for such fine logs. When evening came, the woodcutter would make his way slowly back to his cottage, carrying his heavy load and feeling very worried, for his pockets were empty and he had no money to buy enough food to feed his hungry family. One evening, the woodcutter sat by the fire, his head in his hands, thinking hard about how he could get enough money to feed them all. His wife gently patted his shoulder and told him she had an idea. They must take Hansel and Gretel into the forest and leave them there. The woodcutter shook his head and groaned, for he could not do this. However, he finally agreed when his wife said that the villagers might find them and give them food and shelter. Whilst their mother and father were talking, Hansel and Gretel lay awake in their beds, shivering with cold and hunger. When they heard what was to happen to them, Gretel began to cry. Hansel comforted her till she fell asleep. Then he quietly crept outside, filled his pockets with shiny white pebbles, and quickly scrambled back into bed. Early the next morning, as soon as the sun slowly rose up into the sky, the birds began to sing loudly and sweetly in the tall trees close to the cottage. Their lovely tunes filled the air and awoke the woodcutter, his wife, and their 2 children. Quickly they got dressed and went out into the warm sunshine. Then Hansel and Gretel's mother gave them a small piece of dry bread, for she had only a little food left in her cupboard, and told them to collect a basket, as they would all be going into the forest. When they were ready, the woodcutter, carrying his axe over his shoulder, led the way along the narrow green paths deep into the forest. From time to time Gretel stopped and looked around, hoping she'd see the wood elves and fairies. Maybe they were playing hide and seek in the trees too. Hansel followed behind, but he was busy dropping his shiny white pebbles on the woodland path. The family walked a very long way, and Gretel began to feel rather tired and hungry, for she had been so busy trying to see if she could catch a glimpse of any elves and fairies that she forgot to collect any berries to eat. Their father agreed it was time to have a rest, so they gathered some twigs and soon they sat down by a warm fire. Their mother told Hansel and Gretel to rest, whilst she and their father went further into the forest to cut logs.
Hansel and Gretel go out to gather wood into the forest where the trees are good. Thick twigs and thin twigs and dried up branches too. Short twigs and long twigs, these will surely do. Hansel and Gretel have gathered quite a pile. Now they are tired and must rest here a while. Curled up and comfy, they soon fall asleep. All woodland creatures will in their safety keep.
The warmth of the fire made the two children feel very sleepy, and before long they closed their eyes and fell fast asleep. As they slept, the elves and fairies gathered round them in a fairy ring and sang and danced in the moonlight.
Elves and fairies gathered in a ring, dancing, dancing, merrily they sing, to the music of the babbling stream. Hansel, Gretel, happily they dream.
When they finally woke, it was dark, and Gretel began to cry. Hansel comforted her and said he could take her safely home, as the full moon would shine on the white pebbles he had dropped, and they could follow them all the way. So they started to follow the pebbles, and by dawn they were back home. One night, not long afterwards, Hansel and Gretel heard their parents talking, and this time there was only half a loaf left for them all to share. Although their father didn't want to take his children, whom he dearly loved, into the woods, he finally agreed with his wife that this was what they must do. Once again Hansel comforted Gretel, and when his father and mother were asleep, he crept downstairs, hoping to collect some more pebbles. But each door he tried was locked, and no matter how hard he pulled and tugged, they would not open. So he had to creep quietly back to bed. The next morning at sunrise, Hansel and Gretel were each given a small piece of bread, which they put in their basket. When their father had collected his axe and rope, the family made their way deep into the forest. Once again, Hansel followed behind, and from time to time he broke off a crumb from his piece of bread and dropped it on the pathway. Once again they stopped and rested by a warm fire, whilst their father went deeper into the forest to collect wood.
Hansel and Gretel go out to gather wood into the forest where the trees are good. Thick twigs and thin twigs and dried up branches too. Short twigs and long twigs, these will surely do. Hansel and Gretel have gathered quite a pile. Now they are tired and must rest here a while. Curled up and comfy, they soon fall asleep. All woodland creatures will in their safety keep.
But even though they tried hard not to fall asleep, the warmth of the fire and the gentle flickering of the flames soon lulled them into a deep, deep sleep. Meantime, the woodland creatures and birds, seeing Hansel scattering his bread, came down onto the pathway, and soon they had eaten every crumb up.
Blackbird flew down from a tree, on a path a crumb did see, ate it up and called the thrush. Thrush then flew down from a tree, had a breadcrumb for his tea, called his friend the little sparrow. Sparrow flew down from a tree, had a breadcrumb for his tea, called his friend the robin redbreast. Robin flew down from a tree, had a breadcrumb for his tea, called his friend the handsome magpie. Magpie flew down from a tree, had a breadcrumb for his tea, called his friend the perky blue-tit. Blue-tit flew down from a tree, had a breadcrumb for his tea, called his friend the big fat cuckoo. Cuckoo flew down from a tree, had a breadcrumb for his tea, called his friend the big barn owl. Barn owl hooted loud and clear, to say 'twas night, no longer day, so all the birds then flew away.
When Hansel and Gretel awoke, they were cold and frightened. As they warmed their hands over the glowing embers, Hansel told Gretel she must not be afraid, but wait till the moon came up behind the tall trees to light the pathway. Then they could see the crumbs he had scattered and find their way safely home. When the moon rose into the night sky, they looked here and there, but they could not find any crumbs, for the woodland creatures and birds had eaten them all. They walked the whole night and the following day, but they could not find their way out of the forest. The next day they were very tired and hungry. On and on they walked, until suddenly the path stopped, and they saw in front of them a little house. They went closer and had a careful look. Hansel even had a long sniff, for he thought it smelt like gingerbread. Yes, he was right. The walls were made of gingerbread, the roof was made of red fruit drops, and the windows of clear sugar.
Gingerbread children, sweet and kind, once made a house you'd love to find. The walls were made of gingerbread, the roof was fruit drops coloured red, the chimney was a stick of rock, the door was one whole chocolate block, the windows made of mint so clear, through which inside you just could peer. Gingerbread children, sweet and kind, once made a house you'd love to find.
Hansel and Gretel stepped right up to the house, and because they were so very hungry, they broke off a piece and began to nibble. Oh, it really did taste delicious. A moment later, they heard a tap, tap, tap. The door creaked and slowly opened. A woman, as old as the hills, crept out. Hansel took Gretel's hand and pulled her away, but the old woman, tapping her stick, called them back. She told them not to be frightened, and she led them inside her little house. Then she gave them some hot milk, sugar pancakes and rosy apples to eat. Hansel and Gretel were so tired that they soon fell fast asleep. But the next morning, before they were awake, the old woman, who was really a witch, built a fire in her stove. When it was ready, she shook Hansel and dragged him to a cage. She pushed him in and locked the door. Gretel woke up and was very frightened. The old woman told her she must cook and clean all day and take food to Hansel so that he would be fat enough to eat.
Gretel, you must cook and clean, for Hansel looks so very lean. He must now be fattened up. Do make sure you wash that cup. Sweep the floor and brush the mat. Hansel needs to be quite fat. Fetch more twigs there in the yard. Shine a table, polish card. Hansel must be ready soon. It's halfway through the afternoon.
Day after day, Gretel swept the house and baked fresh cakes, and day after day the old woman crept up to Hansel's cage to see if he was fat and tasty enough to eat. But when she told him to put his finger out for her to feel, he stuck out a thin twig. As the days went by, the old woman became very cross. She stamped her bent legs and waved her stick angrily at Gretel. Surely the young boy must be ready to eat.
More twigs will make the fire burn bright, so bring them in before it's night, or my pet bats will flap about and make you scared, so you will shout, and all my witchy friends will come and see that all my work is done.
Early the next morning, the old woman told Gretel to collect more twigs for the stove. She lit the fire, and soon the flames were glowing brightly. The old woman rubbed her hands and nodded with delight. The oven would soon be hot enough to bake the children in. Then she beckoned to Gretel to step inside and see if it was ready for baking. But Gretel shook her head, saying she didn't know. By this time, the old woman was feeling very impatient. Oh, very well, she thought to herself. I'll just have to try it myself. As soon as she had climbed into the stove, Gretel quickly pushed the door firmly shut. She ran outside and freed Hansel from the cage, and hand in hand they ran inside the house, where there were chests in every corner. At that moment, the gingerbread walls moved, and before them stood all the young boys and girls from the village who had been turned into gingerbread house by the wicked old woman. Now the spell had been broken.
Gingerbread children, sweet and kind, once made a house you'd love to find. The walls were made of gingerbread, the roof was fruit drops coloured red, the chimney was a stick of rock, the door was one whole chocolate block, the windows made of mint so clear, through which inside you just could peer. Gingerbread children, sweet and kind, once made a house you'd love to find.
children followed Hansel and Gretel into the house, and opening up the chests, they filled their pockets and aprons with pearls and jewels. Then they set off once again into the forest, singing and dancing as they went. After a while they came to a river with neither stepping stones nor a bridge. Then they saw a beautiful swan followed by her young cygnets come gracefully down the stream. Lifting her head high as if to say, "We'll take you across," she glided to the bank. Then Hansel, Gretel and the village children were carried across the river. Having thanked the swan and her cygnets, they began walking along the green woodland paths once again. After they had been walking for a while, they came to a part of the forest that they recognised, and finally, from afar off, they saw their father's house. Taking Gretel's hand, Hansel ran as fast as he could, waving his hand and shouting with delight. Hearing the noise, the woodcutter came out, and seeing his two children safe and well, he ran and hugged them joyfully. They emptied their pockets and showed him all their treasures. Now they would be able to have enough food to eat and live happily ever after. As for the village children, well, they too ran home to greet their parents, and that evening there was a party with singing and dancing. Now everyone was happy, and they could all live peacefully once again.
Hansel and Gretel go out to gather wood into the forest where the trees are good. Thick twigs and thin twigs and dried up branches too. Short twigs and long twigs, these were short